Edu. The meeting is scheduled to conclude at 8:30. If, however, we cover the agenda items before then, the meeting will close early. All agenda, minutes, meeting links, and commission materials will be posted on the commission's website. We will not be responding to comments or questions posted in the chat. If you have questions or comments that you would like to share after the meeting, you may do so by emailing the commission at blueribbonethics@ubalt.edu. There are times during tonight's meeting when commission members will have the opportunity to ask questions or to make comments. If you're on camera, please raise your hand to indicate that you have a comment or question, and I will acknowledge you. If you're off camera, please use the raise hand function in Zoom. And so with that, we want to move very quickly to a review of minutes of the previous meeting. Those minutes were provided to commission members by email on yesterday. And so this question is for our commission members. Do any of you have any comments or changes to the drafted minutes? Okay. Seeing no changes or corrections, can I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved. So moved, pardon me.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. And with that, the minutes are approved as distributed. So thank you once again very much. And so now I have the pleasure of presenting our first speaker for the evening, our academic expert, and that's none other than Dr. Robin Kempf, who is assistant professor at the School of Public Affairs at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. She is the author of a book entitled The Power of Accountability, Offices of Inspector General on the State and Local Levels, which was published in 2020. And we have also made a copy of the book available to commission members. Dr. Kempf is also a former Inspector General, having served as Inspector General for the Kansas Medicaid program. And Dr. Kempf has been asked to present on her research and on structures of offices of Inspector General with a focus on many of the concerns that we are examining, or that were examined rather, in the best practices research conducted by the Schaefer Center. So thank you very much, Dr. Kempf, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very proud to have a bit of a participation in your work this summer, or this fall, I guess. Yes, I'm a former Inspector General, and I'm also an attorney. I worked for the state of Kansas for over 10 years, with the last position being the Inspector General for the Kansas Health Policy Authority. After that time, I decided to go back to school and get my PhD, and I studied government accountability. So my research interests really focus on those things that we have in place to help keep government accountable to the citizens. And with OIGs in particular, how do we structure OIGs to make them the most effective in helping provide accountability? So I understand some of you have read my book, The Power of Accountability, which I have to say my mom would be very, very proud to hear. As you well know, there's very little scholarly research on OIGs, and much of it that exists is on the federal OIGs. So there's even less on the state and local level. So my book is really looking at the phenomenon that you can observe of this explosion of OIGs on the state and local levels. So I was really looking at why is this happening? And also, while it's happening, why these OIGs are so different. And I'd be surprised if you haven't heard the old saw. If you've seen one OIG, you've seen one OIG. They really are just truly different, despite the fact that they all have this similar mission. So generally, why are OIGs, this concept spreading across the country, is really driven by the public and elected officials' desire for increased accountability. And I want to pause here for a second to give you a definition of accountability. So accountability is really based on a relationship between two parties. So you have two parties here. the first party is the actor and the second party is the accountability holder. So the second party allows the first party to explain their decisions. The second party can ask questions, and then the second party decides what the consequences are for the first party. So where does an OIG fit in this scenario? It doesn't. It's neither the first or the second party. It's an intermediary here that examines the actions of the first party and then reports to the second party about what the first party had done. So you can see with this role that it is really critical that the OIG be able to produce credible, reliable information that is fair to the first party, and then the second party can react to. So accountability, though, the reason for more accountability varies depending on where you are. So some places it's just simply a matter of good government. We want the government to do good things, and so this is a key element. Other places there's a crisis, and so we want an OIG to deal with addressing that problem. But once the desire for an OIG arrives, then the issue becomes how to design it, how to structure it. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that is really the issue here. Baltimore County created an OIG a couple of years in. Now it's assessing it. Is it designed correctly? Is it designed for the needs of the community? It appears there are also some management issues. How is it being run? My area of expertise is not about how to manage an OIG, although I know a little bit, but it's been so many years since I've been enacting IG that I think that information is better had from acting inspectors general, such as Inspector General Stephen Street, who will speak to you a little bit later. But I would say as a comment that because OIGs are so different from each other, and because they're born of the culture and the community that they're from, I would say that in your search for best practices, you might be hard pressed to find exactly what you would like to find. But to get back to the design and implementation of an OIG, again, every local OIG is different from each other. In my book, I developed this idea of an archetype OIG, because if you're going to say something is different, you need to compare it to something, right? Like how different it is from whatever. And this is this idea of a pure model, an ideal type OIG that is best positioned to do its job. Probably this archetypal OIG doesn't exist anywhere. And I will delve into what makes an archetype a little bit more, but why? Why doesn't any OIG look like the pure OIG? This is what I call the power of accountability. In most locations, although increased accountability is desired through an OIG, the reality of having this oversight isn't really as fun as anticipated. So you see how changes arrive at the local level to sort of mitigate the threat that the OIG might be providing. So I personally think that when the OIG comes knocking and does an investigation or an audit, the public manager who's dealing with this really has no other answer but to say, thank you, I always welcome the opportunity to do a better job for our citizens. You know, ideally that's what happens, and that's the response to recommendations from OIGs. But in corrupt places like New Orleans and Chicago and elsewhere, when you criticize powerful people, they don't like it. And so the result then is the design of an OIG that has less than their full component of powers and protections. And that's really why we see such a variety. That's my theory, at least. So let me run through the key elements of this archetype OIG and explain why these elements are thought to be important. The first one is the legal establishment of an OIG in statute or ordinance. And why is this important? It gives the OIG a legal mandate. And also, someone who doesn't like the OIG's work can't easily get rid of it. This doesn't mean that you can't abolish an OIG that's already been established. That happened in Connecticut, that happened in New Jersey. But it does mean that this debate about whether to have an OIG and whether to abolish it is at least in the public eye. And so citizens are there and they can demand an explanation. As you know, the OIG of the Baltimore County is established in the county code, so there's no particular issues there. The second piece that I look at in the archetypal OIG is that their duties include both auditing and investigations. So proactive and reactive approaches to oversight, two sides of really the same coin. Proactive audits look to prevent future problems, whereas reactive investigations look to see what bad things happened in the past. And neither is better or worse. They're both essential really to have full oversight because they complement each other. So here in Baltimore County, I understand the OIG was intended to only do the investigations piece because there's a county auditor who does the auditing piece. And this is absolutely fine. I don't see any particular problems with that bifurcation, as long as, you know, the OIG and the county auditor can work closely together. And I did see a provision in your county code that says that the two can work together, which, you know, solves that issue. The third area I want to talk about is authority or power granted to an OIG to perform its role. So if in the archetypal area, if oversight is going to happen, the OIG needs to access all necessary documents and people, because that's the way that they'll collect information and then report thereon. If people are resistant to this kind of thing, it's helpful for the OIG to have the authority to subpoena the documents and witnesses they need, particularly if those documents and witnesses are outside of the government. So contractors, beneficiaries, that kind of thing. And then finally, law enforcement authority, which allows an OIG to go beyond what they can access through subpoena, gives them authority to execute warrants and make arrests. So it's, you know, yet another step. Another element of authority is whistleblower protections. These protections encourage people, the whistleblowers, to report on problems that they might otherwise not. And so this provides the OIG with a good stream of information to work on. And then last but not least, budget and resources are critical. So you can have the perfect, most wonderful OIG established, but if it has no budget or very little budget and very little staff, it's just not going to be very effective. So again, here in Baltimore County, the OIG is granted in the county code access to county employees and documents. That's wonderful. The OIG has subpoena powers, but no law enforcement powers, which is actually quite common to not grant OIGs this law enforcement power. In my observations, I think that this would be an issue. If you were to pursue it, it would be an issue that if, like, the IG felt that she can't do her job without, then she would bring it, you know, to the county council, and, you know, it'd be worth revisiting. But I don't think, it doesn't appear that that's an issue here. And then finally, in the archetype, there's this issue of independence. And this is the idea that the OIG should not be pressured to look at something but not others, or persuaded to pull punches when there's real evidence of wrongdoing, or otherwise manipulated to do its job. So otherwise, you know, if these protections aren't there, no one can rely on the OIG's reports. They would be biased, right? And there's many, many different ways to protect independence for this archetype. And just by the way, I'm currently working on a project with a law professor from Villanova, and we are developing an independence index, which would examine all of the characteristics of an OIG and then place them on a continuum from 0 to 1, 0 being that they lack all independence, and 1 being that they have the full complement of independence protections. So to be determined, but I hope that that'll be useful in the future. In any case, I want to turn now to some of the specific questions that I received from Dr. Cotton. And these get into the concerns that your commission has expressed. So there was a set of questions about oversight of an OIG, and could that be an advisory board form? So this question is excellent. It's who watches the watchers, right? A classic question. I looked it up. It stems from Rome in the 1st and 2nd centuries. So I don't know that we have a perfect answer still, but it is definitely worth asking. It's clear that an important element of an OIG and their independence is that the IG cannot be fired without cause. Because you can imagine that an IG who has a fear of being fired might not do the job to the best of their abilities, especially if they're worried about the consequences. But what about the IG that you get a complaint about? Who should examine the IG's behavior and determine if there's cause for being fired? And I don't think that there is one single way to handle this issue. But I would say in my research and my experience, it would typically not be anyone who falls within the IG's jurisdiction, because that would open up possible retaliation against the IG if the person didn't like what the IG said, right? If something was not, pleasurable, shall we say. So on the federal level, this process is handled by Council of Inspectors General. It's called CIGI, the Council of Inspectors General on Integrity and Effectiveness or Efficiency, I'm sorry. And they manage these complaints. This is where people report about IGs. And as experts in the field, then they have the ability to determine if the IG's behavior met auditing standards, investigation standards, or whether the IG is acting arbitrarily and capriciously and damaging, the objective independent role of the IG. I would note, on the other hand, on the federal level, the president can fire an IG without cause. So all they have to do is provide a 30-day notice to Congress. So you can see there's a clear tension between the role of CIGI and the president's authority here. So here, if the IG has the authority to investigate county council members, then county council members should probably not be in the role of assessing complaints against the IG. And again, I'm not an expert here as you guys are, but as I read the code, it appears that the IG has a very broad jurisdiction over county government. So it would be up to you sort of to sort through who would be appropriate. Maybe a panel of judges if the circuit court isn't under the OIG's jurisdiction or something like that. But that is a serious issue for this commission to grapple with and do it in such a way that makes sense within the constraints of this jurisdiction.
Professor, it's John Larry. I may ask you a quick question on this topic before. I don't know if you're moving on from it, so I don't want to interrupt you.
No, I was, so this is fine.
So, in the federal system, so what does CIGI do when it hears something like this, and what remedies are available? Does CIGI then refer something? Do they write a report? And a related question is, there's a whole, what does for cause mean? We could explore that forever. But does the CIGI review go to the question of whether there is cause for action against a federal IG, or is that a separate determination on other bases?
So I'm not an expert exactly on everything that CIGI does, but I know that they can do, training, coaching, that kinds of thing. They also, like an IG, if they see wrongdoing, they can elevate that to prosecutorial authorities. So you may have noticed in the paper recently that there was an IG on the federal level who's being charged with stealing software. And that actually came about from a SIGI investigation after the IG's own staff reported him to SIGI. So there's a process for that.
Do you know if there's any data at any level about removal of IGs for cause and sort of how often that happens and whether it's typically successful or unsuccessful, because I'm just trying to get to a practical place on this, right? Which is, obviously the things you're saying about not having discretionary authority in someone within the IG scope make complete sense. Obviously, there should be some mechanism to remove an IG who is acting inappropriately, et cetera. The question is, where in between those are you? And so you start to introduce this idea of a advisory board that is not made up of people who regulate it. That makes sense. And then I get to the so what part of the question, like, so what does that advisory board do? And that's why I asked whether the advisory board is involved in some way in making the determination of cause, or whether that cause is guided by an independent body of law or administrative procedure. And I don't want to necessarily get deep into that, and maybe we'll just leave a pin in it. But, that's what I'm sort of driving towards and trying to figure out what's a reasonable middle ground between two extremes, both of which really seem to be impractical and unacceptable. So I leave the question, Ann, for you and your team as well, not to get too distracted by it, but it just seems to me that understanding what models are out there and then the so what part, what happens if, would be useful to me.
So I don't think there's any centralized data collection on that issue of like bad IGs. I know that there's instances, SIGI would know some instances. I have a friend who is, I'm working on another book. I'll be editing this one, but a friend of mine is writing a chapter on leadership and when leadership goes wrong, looking at the IGs as an example. So we know that this happens, but I don't think that there's any systematic data collection on this issue, which makes it very difficult for you. An advisory board makes sense if they're the ones who's making the decision about whether the person should be fired for cause. But the advisory board shouldn't be advising the IG on how to do their job. So it's a tricky thing.
Okay, thank you.
There was a question about whether there should be a different process for dealing with complaints against the IG specifically versus complaints about the IG staff. I did want to mention, it's an important protection to the IG's independence that the IG has full authority to manage their own staff, who they hire and fire, what they pay them, all of those kinds of things should not be manipulated by an external political or actors or agency actors. Otherwise, then the staff independence is challenged, right? So complaints about the IG staff should come to the attention of the IG herself. And that's the person who should deal with that. Getting into this removal authority, let's see if I can help John. It really is best, again, if the person or persons who are subject to the OIG's oversight do not have any role in removal. In your code, it says that the Inspector General, and I'm quoting, may be removed by the county executive before the expiration of the term for which the IG was appointed, only for cause, subject to the approval of the county council by a vote of a majority plus one of the members of the county council. This mirrors the appointment process as well, that the IG is selected by the county executive, but then confirmed by the county council. I can tell you that this two-step process provides more independence to the IG, so that they're not hired and fired simply because they're a friend or they misstepped. I did research with a colleague on the federal OIGs on this two-step appointment process. There are two types of IGs, one that is appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and the other just simply appointed by the agency head. And when I compared those two, it was clear that the ones with the confirmation by the Senate were more productive overall than those who were simply hired by the agency head and who really owed their job directly to the head of the agency that they were overseeing. So there's an important element there. And because you have that two-step process, and because you also have that two-step process for firing, I think this is a strong model. But again, I think it's something to think through what makes sense in your jurisdiction. Now, the question of advisory boards, do IGs typically have advisory boards? My answer would be no, not that I have heard. So again, you want to preserve the independence of the IG, and a group of people telling the IG what to do calls that in question. So the role of such an advisory board would need to be crafted carefully if that was a way that you wanted to go. Likely, it would make sense if the advisory board was giving advice to the county executive, who would then make the decision about retention or firing. There was a question about IGs and conflict of interest policies. I wasn't sure if you meant is the IG itself, should the IG herself be subject to conflict of interest policies, or should the staff? If it's for the IG itself, then I think that should be handled through the hiring process. And any conflict of interest policies for county employees would obviously apply. Your code says, and this is very good practice, that the IG shall be professionally qualified by experience or education in auditing, law, ethics, compliance, government operations, or financial management, and shall be selected solely on the basis of professional ability and personal integrity without regard to political affiliation. This is the statement of the unbiased IG. We don't want a biased IG. So if you were looking to assess if someone met these criteria, the conflict of interest at this point should be discussed, if that makes sense. If you're talking about conflict of interest for staff, again, this is a management problem that should be left to the IG's discretion how to handle. Of course, if there are county conflict of interest rules, they would apply. But I wanted to know, like, in addition to the structural independence that I'm talking about, this design of IGs, there's also an element that comes from the GAO originally, which says that best practices are to assess each employee and their personal biases before they get involved in an audit or investigation. So that is like an internal check to make sure that the individual's biases won't jeopardize the OIG's independent assessments. And there's ways to handle it. If there's, you only have one staff member to do it and they're biased, you report it, you mitigate it in as much as you can. But there is practice for that. I'd like to turn to independent legal counsel. So when I was an inspector general, I had no budget or access to independent counsel, and the agency was pretty adamant that they would not provide that to me. I was asked to use agency counsel. And the fundamental problem here is that the agency's counsel's client is the agency, right? And as IG, I could potentially be reporting an issue about the agency. So that gives rise to the conflict of interest. What I had to do was I had to reach out to the Attorney General to see if I could get representation from there, which fortunately the Kansas Attorney General at the time was amenable to that. But in short, independent counsel is really important. How that's managed, whether it's on retainer or in-house or whatever, is not so important as that it is available. So again, this is something that would need to be thought through, consistent with the county and its culture.
Excuse me, could you outline how the county's IG currently gets legal counsel?
I actually don't know the answer to that. Anne, do you know?
I believe it's through the county attorney. So it's the same way as non-independent counsel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm getting close to the, I just have two more points I want to go through, and then I'd be happy to stand for any questions. There were questions about the OIG's access to documents, and whether they should be able to access deliberative memos or things that were otherwise confidential, executive privilege, and all of that. I think if you want the OIG to provide the full assessment of activities, then there shouldn't be a limit to what they can see. What I have seen in practice is that the IG is allowed to see these confidential items, but then they also must maintain the confidentiality so that when they report to the public, they don't break that confidentiality, but they still have the access to the information that so that they can do their jobs. This thing is very important, in particular with investigations, which is the focus of your IG. If there's wrongdoing, whether it's administrative, civil, or criminal, you don't want to tip your hand to the wrongdoer that you're looking into them, right? So there's a lot of reasons to keep this information confidential and, keep your cards close. So that's sort of what my thoughts were on that. I did want to speak to the duties of ethics oversight provided to the IG in Baltimore County. So for ideal oversight, the IG should not be dealing with any management duties or activities of any kind. And the reason is, the IG cannot oversee its own activities without bias, right? Arguably, the role of training county staff on ethics requirements, providing advisory decisions, determining whether there are violations, are management duties, not oversight. And so housing both of these duties in one place muddies the water a bit. This is not to say that IGs don't do this sort of thing. And the Ohio State IG solely does ethics, including the training, et cetera, the advisory opinions. So it's not like it's unheard of. But you can see that if there's a complaint about how ethics is handled specifically, the IG is not in a position to investigate herself. I was thinking, I don't know the solution necessarily that would be palatable to the county, but it would be possible that the Ethics Commission could refer problems to the IG, just like any person could refer problems to the IG to investigate. And then the IG would make recommendations back to the Ethics Commission about what to do. The commission would then decide, do they want to do that or not? They take the recommendation or not. But that might be one way that could sort of bring those duties apart. But again, it would be presumptive of me to take that decision on myself. And then last but not least, setting the budget for the OIG. So budget retaliation against OIGs is unfortunately extraordinarily common experience by OIGs, and Inspector General Stephen Street can tell you how his office has been defunded multiple times by the Louisiana House because some legislator or another was unhappy about some of the investigations that his office was pursuing. That's not a unique story in the OIG world. And really the best, if you want the best protection for an OIG, is you give them a set amount budgeted. And so it would be, for example, a certain percentage of the operating budget. Then that provides clarity to the OIG to know how much they will get. It protects their resources. And also as the operation budget grows, the OIG will grow, which makes sense because if the budget is growing, there's probably more things for the OIG to look at. So that's probably the clearest thing that I've seen happen in places. probably the least protection for the oversight role is when the legislative body allocates the money to the agency who's under the jurisdiction of the OIG, because that agency is in the perfect position to starve the OIG if they don't like the oversight, and you can see how that might be problematic. So that really brings me to the end of my prepared remarks, and I'd be happy to hear what questions you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Kemp. And so we do open it up for questions from commission members. Tom?
Yeah, I had a question, and thank you, because I had several other questions, but you answered them during your presentation. The OIG in Baltimore County has subpoena authority. There's a provision in the statute which says they have to wait 90 days before they can issue a subpoena to give, I guess, a chance for voluntary compliance. Is that unusual?
That is, so I'm going to defer that question to my colleagues
Okay.
because that's a little bit out of my expertise in terms of research.
Okay, and the other another question I read the book and the green book and the model legislation, and most of it made sense. The one thing I wasn't sure about is why is it important for an IG to have law enforcement authority?
If so typically if you don't have law enforcement authority, then you will be investigating solely civil and administrative problems. And so you'll have to you'll have to pass everything on. If you see that there's a slight violation of law, you can't pursue that all the way on your own. And so that has been the justification that I've seen. It was an interesting debate in Connecticut when they abolished their IG. One of the reasons that they gave for that, and it was under it all, it was really a partisan fight. So that's really what was happening there. But they complained that the IG wanted law enforcement power, and they were painting the IG as, you know, wanting to carry a gun and like concerned about bombs under their cars and just like making it look like it was a very extreme. But there's plenty of rational reasons why an IG may have to raid a place to pull records, you know, and so they get a warrant in advance, they pull records, and they have to do this on a surprise because people will hide what they're wrongdoing, right? So that's generally how I understand law enforcement. And I actually would recommend that you also ask this question to Greg Hill and Stephen Street as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Dr. Kemp, this may be an unfair question to ask you. It may be kind of asking you to be somewhat of a Nostradamus, but as a researcher and academician, what do you see as the future of offices of inspectors general, especially local offices around the nation?
Yeah, I don't know if I can ask that. I could tell you where I'm going with my research, and it's going to be more, you know, I've been looking a lot about these structures that, you know, how they're designed, et cetera, et cetera. What I want to look at next is what people are actually doing. So really getting into what types of investigations they're doing, you know, how they consider the ethics of the issue, how they consider the equity of the issue, you know, things like that, and like really digging in, because I think there's, again, going to be a large variety, but I'd like to see what lessons we can pull from how OIGs are doing their jobs.
All right, thank you. Tom?
Yeah, one other question. With the IGs, I kind of lost my train of thought. I'll leave that question.
Okay. Okay. If there aren't any other questions, I don't know, Dr. Kemp, whether you're able to remain on with us or if you will need to leave. Okay. And so before we end, if there are other questions, you'll still be around and we'll be able to ask you those questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And so with that, we will turn to our other experts who have joined us, and that is representatives from the Association of Inspectors General. Mr. Stephen Street Jr. is State Inspector General for the state of Louisiana. He has served in this role since January 2008 and became president of the Association of Inspectors General 7 years later on January 1st, 2015. And Mr. Gregory Hill is the executive director of the Association of Inspectors General. And he previously served as legal counsel to the Florida Department of Corrections Office of Inspector General. And so Inspector Street and Attorney Hill, thank you for joining us, and we turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the way that Greg and I had discussed doing this in a fashion that is most beneficial to you guys is to let Greg go ahead and get started by introducing the members to the Association of Inspectors General, and in particular, the different services that are offered in the different areas that the AIG can assist with as far as what the goals of this commission are. And then after that, I'm going to provide the perspective of an IG that's had boots on the ground for 15 years. And I think a lot of the questions that were posed to Dr. Kemp, I think I can probably shed some light on and hopefully a little bit more. So I'd like to go ahead and ask our executive director, Mr. Hill, to go ahead and go first, and then I'll follow, and we'll be happy to take questions throughout.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson, distinguished commissioners. Thank you for allowing us to appear on behalf of the association and this important work that you're doing. I think Mr. Street obviously went through and set forth the format that we want to try and approach. And my credentials, as you know, I've been with the Association of Inspectors General now for about coming on 3 years. I also teach fraud, waste, and abuse and corruption in public organizations at John Jay College in New York. And as was noted, I served as legal counsel to the Inspector General for the state of Florida Department of Corrections, as well as a long time ago being a police officer in the city of Tampa for about a decade. So investigations and backgrounds, as well as, and one of the things with my tenure at Department of Corrections was serving as the administrative rulemaking attorney for that department for a number of years as well. So with that, what we would like to do is just kind of introduce you to the full Association of Inspectors General, what we are and who we are. The Association of Inspectors General is an international, nonpartisan, not-for-profit professional association established back in October of 1996, over 25 years ago now. And it's basically a training and a educational vehicle to provide and advance the professionalism, the integrity, the competency, and integrity of inspectors general in the work that they do on behalf of the public and the community that they serve. I stress nonpartisan because the association does not traditionally in any way, shape, or form affiliate itself or take a position on any partisan issues. We maintain strict neutrality because the easiest way to undermine the trust or the relationship with the community is to be perceived, whether it be real or just by perception, as a biased or a partisan organization. Our association is currently comprised of over 2,200 IG professionals representing multiple agencies from 41 states, 2 US territories, and 8 foreign countries. As Dr. Kemp noted before, SIGI focuses on the US federal inspectors general community. We focus and direct our services exclusively and intentionally to the inspector general community at the federal, military, state, county, and local levels. As you're probably already aware by the ways of your work, is that On July 5th, President Street was asked to respond to the proposed legislation that was a predecessor to this commission. And the recommendation at that time was to strongly recommend that the proposed bill be reevaluated, and outlined 3 fundamental concerns that were set forth in the letter. And something I think that is worth repeating a little bit, in the sense of kind of providing that backdrop for the commission to keep in mind as they proceed with their work. One of the initial concerns we had was the political appointees of the county administration serving as overseers. And as Dr. Kemp pointed out, that automatically creates a conflict of interest and a lot of logistical problems in that sense. It compromises the integrity of that oversight. And even if it's just a perceived conflict, can create problems, not only for the commission or the overseer body, whatever is decided to be enacted, but with county government as a whole. So we obviously were concerned about that aspect. The second thing that we were concerned with in that initial proposed legislation was what we perceived was excessive authority and powers conveyed to the oversight board to regulate the operational functions of the IG office. When you move into a regulatory mechanism as opposed to an oversight to determine efficiency and compliance of the IG or their office, that creates problems, because I mean, obviously now it's like a steering mechanism. You can control whether it be financially, staffing, policies, procedures, and you actually encroach on the fundamental management responsibilities that most agency heads have. One side note to that, just offhand, that I noted when preparing for this, is that unlike most agencies at the county level and in Baltimore County administration, this commission was created to specifically identify issues related to the legislation, policies, and procedures relating to the Inspector General's office. And I would urge diligence and caution in moving forward with your work, in the sense that that could easily be perceived as a tool to otherwise manipulate or kind of put your thumb on the scale, if you will, in terms of trying to manage or control the office of the Inspector General. And this is particularly pronounced in the sense that other county agencies that are on, transportation, law enforcement, sanitation, these other agencies that exist in Baltimore County, don't have commissions to review and then establish their policies and procedures. So I'd urge caution and diligence in keeping that in mind as you move forward with your work. Finally, the third thing that came about in terms of the proposed legislation that we looked at initially back last year was attempting to implement a funding and policy and procedure mechanisms that could very easily become weaponized and impede the independence or the effectiveness of the Inspector General. Once that independence and the effectiveness are impaired, you diminish the value and you diminish the returns available to the citizens of Baltimore County. So the association provides a number of different services to its members. And as I mentioned before, we are international. So what we've been able to do is garner the resources from all those members and the Inspector Generals from those offices over the years. And one of the key products that we were able to produce through this process was the principles and standards for offices of Inspector General. Now, these are broad standards, and the reason they're broad is because, as Dr. Kemp pointed out, is you meet one Inspector General, you met one, and there's so many variations that can be demographic, it can be political, it can be enabling legislation, it could be funding, it could be staffing. There's so many variables that to sit down and say there's one standard best practice, one standard applicable to everything is very difficult that applies to an individual situation such as Baltimore County. And so what the association did back in 1999, they established a committee, and they tasked this committee with establishing this, what we now refer to as the Green Book. to set up standards and principles that would be applicable to the establishment of an inspector's general office, the investigations, the audits, and the inspections and evaluations segments of those offices. So that went through a long process, and in 2001, after multiple reviews and revisions and meetings, the board of directors, and for those who don't know, the board of directors for the Association of Inspectors General, there's 36 of them. So they finally came to consensus on the principles that were drafted and deemed that they accurately represented the broadest, most applicable standards and principles that could be implemented on a wide basis for all the Inspector General's offices. Key in those segments, as everybody will, if you've had a chance to look at those, is the independence of the Inspector General's office. The requirement that the Inspector General office be free from even the appearance of conflict of interest, actual or perceived, as I mentioned earlier. And hiring qualified individuals to do that and making sure that they're adequately trained and that they have the most current skills and training that's available in doing that. Which leads us to the second major project that we provide to Inspector General communities is what we call our Certified Inspector General Institute programs. These are 4 different programs, Inspector Generals, which are basically leaderships, investigators, which are almost always our largest group of students and attendees, auditors, and then the inspector evaluator courses. It's a week-long training program. They cover legal issues, cognitive bias, ethics, report writing, media management. Again, there's a whole week-long, and when I say week-long, we start Monday mornings at 8 o'clock. We go until Friday afternoon, usually around 3 or 4 o'clock. And after they've been able to finish this week-long course, by which they also have to qualify to gain access to, it's not just walk in and apply. They have to be eligible to and designated to apply. They attend the week, and then they take an examination at the end, and they are then issued a certificate that certifies them in their particular field. To date, we've issued 865 certified Inspector General certifications, over 1,500 certified Inspector General investigator certifications, 722 Inspector General auditor certifications, and 139 certified Inspector General inspector evaluator. I'll note that's the lowest number because that program's only been in existence, I think about 1.5 years, 2 years now. So that's our smallest and our newest of programs. Unlike some programs that have you do a certification, you study and take an exam and you're done, our certifications actually require them to remain actively engaged in the Inspector General community through the membership of the program of our association. And even more importantly, by maintaining continuing professional education credits on a yearly basis. So that ensures and provides a mechanism to ensure that the training is provided as well. Quickly, we are going to reinitiate our in-person live training. Our annual training conference will be in Washington, D.C. We were silenced for a couple of years between COVID and hurricanes, but this is another 2.5-day training that's provided. And we're now expanding into different tracks that are offering varieties for different practitioners to gain some expertise in those. All of these training programs are authorized continuing professional education credits through NASBA accreditation, which we're authorized to issue, and we get audited in that respect. A fourth program that we offer in terms, and it kind of applies a little bit in terms of how do you determine or assess an Inspector General's office, is our peer review program. It started out relatively small and kind of just it's a volunteer program. Agencies go through it. It ranges anywhere from 4. It started out with just 3 or 4 reviews of different agencies over the course of a year. And for 2022, we're going to have over 14 different agencies evaluated this year. Some are handled virtually, but most are on site. And except for the cost of travel or hotel rooms to handle those. The team, there is no cost to those at this point. I can, and I'll let Stephen move forward with his part and address some of the other things, but I can certainly answer some questions on terms of the independence of legal counsel. Having been in that situation at Department of Corrections, I was an agency attorney assigned out to the Inspector General's office. And to say that there was conflict and inherent conflicts in that was really problematic, but it's certainly something to keep in mind when you structure or how you look to structure your legal counsel that's available to the Inspector General for Baltimore County. I would just strongly recommend that you provide some mechanism for them to have independent counsel outside of the county government entity. I work for the state, but even at the state, if we had to go to the Attorney General, that still fell into the state-run system. So in essence, you were just working from one agency manager under the state to a different one. That still didn't necessarily resolve a conflict issue. So certainly happy to discuss that a little bit further if anybody has questions on that. But at now, and to be respectful of everybody's time, I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to President Street.
Thank you, Greg. And we are going to certainly try to allow plenty of time for any questions that you guys have. You know, that's part of the goal. But let me introduce myself for those of you who have not met me. My name is Stephen Street. I am, for the past 15 years, I've been the Inspector General for the state of Louisiana. And for the past nearly 8 years, the president of the National Association of Inspectors General. I want to thank you for the kind invitation to be here today. I want you to know that your work is important. This is the part of my role as president has been to go all over the country and interact with IGs all over the country. And to see the fact that there is a commission that has been put together to examine these issues and to proceed with caution and care to make sure they get it right, that's very encouraging. And it's the kind of thing that I would encourage just about anywhere. Let me just tell you, I've been a lawyer since 1989. All of that time has been in the criminal justice system in various forms. I started out working as a staff attorney for a court of appeal, handling criminal appeals and writs exclusively. Following that, I became an East Baton Rouge Parish public defender. I did that for 6 years, where I represented thousands of criminal defendants and tried jury trials, everything from capital murder down to the most basic drug offenses, burglaries and such. I did that for 6 years and then made the jump to white collar defense in federal court, and actually was pulled into a couple of very large cases that involved, it was really my first exposure to the world of public corruption. That is public officials and elected officials being charged with crimes that were connected to the offices that they held. And so much so that I got involved in a racketeering case down in New Orleans that involved multiple elected state senators, state representatives, and other fairly high profile individuals. Following that trial, not too long after that, was offered the opportunity to take over a public corruption unit with the Attorney General's office, and did that for 8 years. Again, trying the criminal public corruption cases, and then received a phone call in the fall of 2007 from the incoming governor-elect, his chief of staff. Part of their anti-corruption initiative was to retool the Inspector General's office. Well, in Louisiana, the IG's office was created in 1988 pursuant to an executive order and was functioning pretty much like an internal audit shop. Was definitely not independent, did not have any real authority, and the focus was what some people felt was duplicative with our state auditor. They sort of did the same type of work. So I was approached about taking the office over, and let me give you guys context for the environment in which in Louisiana at the time. We were 2 years removed from one of the greatest natural disasters in American history, Hurricane Katrina. A storm that destroyed over 200,000 homes along the Gulf Coast and kept the city of New Orleans underwater for more than a month, and displaced hundreds of thousands of people throughout the United States. As one might expect, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, there were a lot of fraudsters. Fraud materialized in every way that you can possibly imagine. From crooked contractors showing up to take advantage of people, to folks stealing the government funds that were being, processed through FEMA for people, to public officials getting involved in various criminal schemes for which many of them went to federal prison. And so the mayor of New Orleans, Ray Nagin, went to jail, along with a number of people that were involved in some of that post-Katrina corruption. And on the North Shore of Lake Pontchartrain, St. Tammany Parish, you had your DA, your coroner, your sheriff, and then several small town mayors and parish councilmen all went to jail for various types of corruption. So we were in an environment where the public was expressing outrage. Now, when I go around the country, Louisiana has a very well-earned reputation for being one of the most challenging public corruption environments in the country. But I've always said, and it's a little bit of a joke, but there's some truth to it, and that the corruption was not necessarily worse where I am here in Louisiana. It's just that for many decades or even centuries down here, we seem to be much prouder of it than everybody else. And so I tend to make fun of my colleagues in Chicago and where, no matter where you go, whether it be New York, Florida, I can always pull cases, and because public corruption is going to exist wherever there are human beings, money, power, and the opportunity to do the wrong thing. So that's human nature. It's going to exist. And so please understand, and I think you guys already know this, that your situation is not unique to Baltimore by any stretch of the imagination. And I think I can state that with confidence now, after having served for nearly 8 years as the president of this national association. One of the things that, when I went ahead and agreed to become the next state IG, and part of the process was to, in the very next legislative session, and we had the right political winds blowing to achieve this. We never could have done it today or any other time that I can think of. But we created or passed a statute that gave the Louisiana Inspector General, designated us a law enforcement agency, set us up with very strong subpoena powers and all of the authority that is available to law enforcement, with the exception of arrest power. And there are the Louisiana OIG statute is worth a look. I know Robin has looked at it as part of her research, but we're set up in a way that makes the office very independent, but also puts safeguards in place to guard against possible abuse, because we understand that IGs are in a position to do great harm if they don't do their jobs, with integrity and ethically. What I want to do is, so we are a law enforcement agency and we function that way. And I'll be happy to take questions about that as I conclude this. Not every IG has law enforcement powers, but there are many reasons why it's a good idea if you can do it. That's not possible politically in a lot of jurisdictions. But what I want to do is come to you guys tonight as a 15-year Inspector General, somebody who has had boots on the ground in one of the toughest public corruption environments in the United States. And to tell you just a little bit about my experience down here, because I think it would provide proper context for everything else that I'm going to share with you tonight. First of all, the IG down here is appointed for a 6-year term. The governor gets to appoint the IG. The IG has to be confirmed by the Louisiana Senate. Once the IG is confirmed, the IG may not be removed without a majority vote of both the House and Senate, plus the governor has to sign off on it. So it would require, it sort of presumes that there's really good cause for such removal. It's obviously the statute's been in place for 15 years nearly, and so far we haven't had to put that to the test. The 6-year term, by the way, is designed to overlap the governor so that you don't always end up with a political replacement when there's a new governor that comes in. I have been appointed twice by a Republican and once by a Democrat, which I believe has given our office significant bipartisan credentials, which has increased trust on both sides of the aisle. I can tell you that and Robin brought it up briefly, but in 2012, there was an effort to completely strip the funding from the Inspector General. As a matter of fact, we were completely erased from the Louisiana state budget for a period of almost 2 months. We were able to get the money back after a lot of fighting and a lot of public embarrassment for the state in the national news and elsewhere. That was, quite frankly, a vulnerability that none of us saw coming. And without going into specifics, I can tell you that we were involved in a very detailed and serious investigation of an extremely popular public official down here in Louisiana. And to say that the actions that we were taking had infuriated some people would be an understatement, no question about it. This was just a fellow that was, there were folks that didn't want him to be messed with in terms of any sort of investigation. And so 2012, we successfully won that fight. We completed our investigation and released a very scathing report. And then in the following year, actually made a criminal case involving one of the high-ranking members of that agency that resulted in a conviction after a criminal trial. So fast forward 4 years to 2016, we have a new governor coming in, a brand new elected Democrat, replacing a 2-term Republican. And we've got all sorts of partisan sniping down at the Capitol. But this governor didn't have the opportunity because I was in a second term and was not going to be up for reappointment for several years. So I was the IG, and that was just the way it was. Well, in 2016, another effort was made to completely strip the IG out of the budget. This was also in response to a separate investigation that we had underway. And we had turnover down at the Capitol, that a lot of brand new members of the legislature that were not necessarily as familiar with the process yet. This time I had some advance warning, and I was able to sort of line up a means of defending the office and getting the message out to the public. There was so much public outrage that basically the money was zeroed out on a Monday. We had it back in on Thursday by acclamation. And all of the people that were behind the effort to defund the Inspector General did not speak up to oppose that effort to put the money back in. And so why do I share these stories with you? And you can also talk about the New Jersey State IG, which was shut down after 5 successful years under Mary Jane Cooper, or the Connecticut State IG that was shut down. I put this in terms of Newton's third law. You are going, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Now, I'll share with you guys, one of the first people I met with after becoming the Louisiana State IG was a gentleman named Bob Sarasoli. He's one of the original founders of our Association of Inspectors General, also the original Massachusetts State IG. Developed a great reputation up there as a tough as nails IG who waded into the very tough political cases and did a good job. But he told me the very first time we ever had lunch together, he told me, Stephen, they're going to try to shut you down. And I couldn't believe it, because we had the wind at our back. The public was so supportive of what we were trying to do. But he predicted it. He told me, he said, once you get going and you upset the wrong people, it's going to happen and you need to be ready for it. Well, Bob was, as you, Mr. Chairman, mentioned Nostradamus earlier, that Bob Sarasoli really was prophetic in that way about the things that happened in Louisiana towards the Inspector General's office. Well, the last time that happened was 2016, and we have not had any trouble since then. The office has a 98% conviction rate on federal criminal cases. We've averaged roughly 5 times our annual appropriation in fraud and corruption identified. That's been really steady throughout my time as the IG. But the point that I want to make, and that will hopefully be the context for the rest of our discussion tonight, is that no matter where IGs exist, you can pick any of the 50 states you want, or any of the 41 states where they exist today, or at the county level, or at the local municipal level. IGs that do the job right are going to encounter resistance from those that they oversee. It is literally Newton's third law. And it's the type of thing that is definitely not unique to Baltimore. We've seen it in places like Palm Beach County. We've seen it out in California. Opposition to the IG is sort of a natural, there's sort of a natural tension that's always going to exist between an inspector general that's determined to do the job correctly and those that are subject to the IG's jurisdiction. So you've heard a couple times tonight, if you've met one IG, you've met one IG. And that is a true statement as it relates to IGs around the country. But I think what I'd like to do is to try to draw a straight line through all of it for you. If you're familiar with the standards that we have, the Green Book, the straight line that you can draw through every successful IG in the United States and abroad is independence. An IG that is not independent cannot be successful. It's just as simple as that. IGs that are independent, still have to work to be successful. But what does it mean to be independent? Well, it doesn't mean that you give IGs godlike authority where they never answer to anyone. That's not what we're seeing here. But on the issues, for instance, access to records, proper funding, proper authority, and not having to deal with over legislation or micromanagement of their daily affairs, whether it be through an oversight board or through the passage of legislation that essentially paralyzes the ability of an IG to do the job right. And so I'm going to say something that you might not even have considered yet. One of the common traits for every independent inspector general is that those IGs have discretion to run the office the way they see fit. Now, they've got to operate according to standards. The Green Book is the place to start for most IG's office. A lot of IG's offices that have an audit section or use the Red Book or the Yellow Book, depending on the type of auditing that they're doing. There are various standards, and they've got to operate according to standards. And they've got to do things like make sure they're free from conflict of interest and impairments and such. But discretion allows for the sort of symbiont mutual respect relationship between the IG and those that the IG oversees that can really lead to very positive developments for those that are subject to the IG's jurisdiction. I'll give you an example. In Louisiana, a few years back, a complaint hit my desk about a young lady that was employed as an administrative assistant for a very large state agency. And this young lady had turned in 40 hours of sick leave and then proceeded, she was in her early 20s, and then went on vacation to Jamaica and proceeded to post photographs of her trip in Jamaica. Essentially, she posted proof of her own violations of the policies concerning sick leave and such. What I did in that situation as the IG, I had a couple of choices. I could assign staff to it, go investigate it, and go ahead and put out a report that really embarrassed the hell out of everybody. Got a couple of days of, maybe a day or two of a little media splash. Or I went to the agency head directly and I said, listen, this is what we have. I had a one-on-one meeting with that person and said, this is what we have. One of our fields that we're required to look at from time to time is mismanagement. Well, mismanagement to me is going to be once you're made aware of a problem and refuse to do something about it. That when it really starts, or if you create an environment where it's so easy for bad things to happen. Either one of those deals. Anyway, I went and sat down with this agency head. I said, look, this is what we have. Now, how would you like to go ahead and handle this as an agency head? And that's exactly what they did. They went ahead and went through a process of discipline with this young lady, and she received job discipline actually, and was required to pay back the sick leave and or have it deducted, from annual at a later time. But there was no report. There was no, gotcha. We weren't out there trying to just get a big splash and embarrass somebody. One of the philosophies of my office, especially since we've been given law enforcement powers, is we're determined to focus on the most significant corruption that exists out there. And that usually for us means that it's corruption that might result in criminal charges. And if you ever look at the Louisiana OIG website, you'll see that every headline of OIG in the news of late have to do with successful criminal cases that have been brought by our office. But that doesn't mean that all we look at is criminal cases. Sometimes we look at outrageous waste. And for instance, in the wake of a hurricane, which we get lots of those down here, unfortunately, we did a report that our Homeland Security Department and the National Guard ordered $17 million worth of ice and allowed it to melt in an unrefrigerated warehouse. And the ice that did make it to the public ended up costing $28 for every 10-pound bag. And so that was worthy of our attention, obviously. But we're not into nitpicking at management. And I think that's, we want to create a relationship of mutual respect where they understand that if we show up, that it is something that is serious and that they need to take seriously. And that we also have the ability to, when necessary, to compel production of records or what have you. But I think that a lot of people don't even consider the symbiont relationship that can exist between an IG and those they oversee. It doesn't have to be hostile. Sometimes it is hostile. And therefore, that's why you have to have the IG protected, first of all, from being fired for doing the job, protected from having their funding stripped when people get upset about an investigation, protected from arbitrary attempts to dial back authority, access, and such. And again, this happens with all IGs. Back in 2015, the Department of Justice tried to carve out their entire National Security Division from review by the Inspector General, Michael Horowitz. And they wrote a memo that was 68 pages that tried to say the word all didn't mean all. It took a lot of, it defied common sense. But the result of that was the passage of the IG Empowerment Act, which was signed by President Obama. That was the last piece of legislation that he signed before he left office. And so knowing that there's the equal and opposite reaction, that's going to come in the form of resistance to IGs, and the ways in which IGs can be sort of attacked. We've talked about funding, which is one of my main weaknesses down here, although I think now we've hopefully put that issue to bed for a while. Access to records, and having independent counsel, that's critical. And let me go so far as to say one of the biggest conflicts of interest, and I know Greg probably experienced this down in Florida. If you have an attorney that is employed by the entity that is subject to IG oversight, and then they, for instance, want to sit in on interviews of county employees, they've got more than one dog in the hunt. It's just that simple. It's the basic rules of professional responsibility. I know there are several attorneys on this commission, and you guys know that those rules are the same everywhere. You need to not have that conflict of interest or even the perceived conflict of interest. Well, it's very difficult to represent both an individual employee then also look out for the best interests of the agency and the agency head, especially if the employee might potentially be a whistleblower or candidly talk about problems that may exist there. So I can tell you ideally with regard to counsel, having an independent attorney that's employed by the IG with protected funding for their salary is the best way to approach that, in my humble opinion. But so what I wanted to do was to sort of, I know that Anne had given, and Robin tried to respond to a lot of these things, and I'm happy to answer questions, but what I wanted to let you guys know, I mean, Louisiana is, again, it's a place with a well-earned reputation for public corruption, and really it's a miracle almost that I'm still here in this job after 15 years. I've got, I believe, 3.5 years on my third term, and at that point, you know, we'll see what happens. But I do have the protection of not being able to be removed without both Senate and House approval, which would be, I think the presumption with that is that anything that would require that is going to get a lot of media attention. And so it would, you know, if there were significant cause where there was a possibility of losing that sort of vote, I'm sure that the IG would resign and move on. And we've seen that in other jurisdictions. I'm happy to answer, you know, specific questions from you guys, and to maybe even cover some of the specific areas that that Anne had talked about. But I'll close with this before we open it up. I'll take you back to 1973 and 74, the Watergate scandal, which everybody's familiar with. We all know that President Nixon resigned as a result of that. But what a lot of people may not remember is that as a result of the Watergate investigation, 68 public officials were charged with crimes. 68. 48 of those people were convicted, either found guilty or pleaded guilty. Included amongst those 48 were 2 United States attorneys general, the president's White House chief of staff, White House counsel, and deputy counsels. And if you guys remember, Woodward and Bernstein from the Washington Post were the ones that broke that story. They had an inside source, and they just kept the pressure up until one day President Nixon resigned under threat of impeachment. And now imagine a scenario where Woodward and Bernstein would be actually governed by the folks that in Mr. Nixon's administration, like that they'd have to rely on them for budget, rely on them for their authority to proceed. That's the sort of conflict that you're looking to avoid, and by no means am I suggesting any scenario where the IG cannot be held accountable or at least have the checks and balances in place. And I'll give you 2 examples. One of the safeguards that's in place down here in Louisiana is that the IG cannot have held elected office for at least 2 years prior to appointment and cannot qualify to run for elected office for 4 years post separation. And that's to give the public confidence that we are not using the powers of the office to set ourselves up for a political run. Because as you know, 4 years is an eternity politically. And there are, you know, we have IG, strict confidentiality of IG records. That's to protect whistleblowers. It's to protect the falsely accused, and to also protect the integrity of investigations. So I guess the thing to do now, rather than to just drone on, is to let you guys fire away with specific questions. But the last observation before we do that is that some of the areas that Anne sent to me were very detailed and really down in the very deep weeds of how investigations are conducted. And my general caution to the commission is that you're not going to find best practices on those things, because I'm not aware of any IGs that are regulated at that level. You don't want to put a situation in place where the IG is pretty much paralyzed because they've got a set of rules that are so rigid that they don't have proper discretion to run the office the way they see fit. And so there's a lot of different areas, but when you're talking about interviews, handwritten notes, whether or not to record, all of those kinds of things. I'm happy to talk about them, but I think we have to be most cautious with, getting involved with trying to regulate those things for the IG. The way you handle that is to take great care in the person that's appointed to be the IG, and then you hold them to a set of standards, that are already out there. So, are there questions from anybody in particular? Because I don't want to. I want to make sure that we respect everyone's time, and also that that we have an opportunity for everybody to get their questions and concerns addressed.
Thank you, President Street and Executive Director Hill. Are there any questions from the commission members?
Mr. Chair, I'll try. I don't know what to call you fellows. Is it Mr. Street, IG Street?
Mr. Star, you could call me Stephen. That's actually the one that works best.
Oh, you can call me John.
but my title is Inspector General, but I'm actually, and whatever you prefer is fine.
Thanks. Well, I don't want to speak for other commissioners, but I'm sort of starting to get the rhythm of all of this. There's a series of these topics. You probably have heard about them. We've organized our thinking a little bit, and we're trying to measure them against, if not best practices, and at least some sort of mean or whatever. Are we outside the norm? If so, is there a justification for that? Are we inside the norm? And I guess maybe this is an unfair question. I don't know if it's your role, but I don't know if you've taken a look at the Baltimore County structure or know it because of the work that both you've done and your colleague has done. Is there anything noteworthy, particularly noteworthy in it? The one thing that I think I've heard a couple of times tonight that is not in the statute is independent counsel.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one thing. I'm just taking notes and I'm trying to compare it against my sort of working set of issues and my preliminary assessment of whether those are in the norm, not in the norm, where are they, et cetera. And I think the one that you all have mentioned a few times is independent counsel.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering if there are others, if you've looked at them, if you have any thoughts, and that would just be useful to draw our attention to, at least for further consideration.
Sure, absolutely. And I tell you what, your question is very well timed, because in preparation for this, I actually did review the Baltimore County legislation, or the bill that's or not the bill, but the law. I actually looked at it because I wanted to make sure that I was familiar with it. One of the first things that I noted was that there is not presently an oversight board. And I will go ahead and say that, I said this earlier, not tonight, but I've said it before, that there are oversight boards for IGs around the country, but it is, I believe, a fact that the large majority of them do not have oversight boards, and the ones that do not have members that are subject to IG jurisdiction. And so I'll say that there's not an oversight board. The other thing that I did notice also, and it was brought up earlier by one of you guys, the 90-day waiting period. Essentially, the IG has to, give somebody 90 days to comply before they would issue a subpoena, which would then, if they didn't comply, be subject to judicial enforcement. I did notice that, and I'll tell you that it's different from the Louisiana IG statute, of course, and it might be comparing apples to oranges because we do have law enforcement authority, but we're not restricted in that fashion on issuing subpoenas, and we really don't issue them. We actually go apply to a judge who then is required by law to grant or deny the subpoena within 72 hours. And I believe that 72-hour time frame is to prevent a judge from sitting on a subpoena request, for political reasons. And so they've got to either grant it or deny it within 72 hours. But that's the only restriction that we have down here on that. And then there was the other thing that there's really the independent counsel is something that I think is fairly crucial. Every IG needs legal representation. One of the things that I failed to mention to you guys earlier is that in 15 years, I've been sued 6 times. I've not yet had to pay a dime to anybody anywhere. So that's good. That means that we're and I don't believe any of the suits. I think 3 of them have already been, we've prevailed in 3, and there's a couple that are still pending, but we expect to prevail in those as well. But independent counsel is a very important facet of that, right? To have the ability to get, first of all, daily legal counsel, on the operations of the office. And that's something that's very valuable to me. I have a 30-year prosecutorial veteran and defense lawyer here who's just been tremendous for me. And so I think it's really critical to at least at the very minimum, they shouldn't be coming from the place where the IG has jurisdiction. That's the basic conflict that you want to try to avoid. I also noticed that you have there's a right of response even on a criminal referral, which is but there is right of response on reports in most IG's offices, and I think that's kind of that varies in terms of the amount of time. But again, when the IG has discretion, they can certainly do things like extend the time, and that's routinely done down here for me because fairness, you want to get it right. And I'll tell you, I didn't make this quote up, but it's one that I repeat all the time. Inspectors general can afford to be controversial. They cannot afford to be wrong. And that's something that I tell my staff every single day. We're human beings. That's why we go through such an onerous process to make sure that we get it right, because we're held to a higher standard, obviously, and should be. But if you ever get it wrong, then it's almost like the cockroach in the bowl of spaghetti. It's an old defense lawyer's argument, but it's like, how many do you need before you throw the whole thing out? And that's what you want to avoid giving ammunition to those who would just be happy to see the IG go away or made obsolete by over regulation and over legislation, whatever you want to call it. Those are the only areas that really stood out to me. I think that it appears to be set up pretty decently, at least for the future. Because obviously, the issue of independent counsel something needs to be looked at, and I'm sure you guys are considering all of that.
Let me, if I may, just go back on 2 of those for a sec. On the 90-day period, I think what we heard from the county administration is not, we're not trying to delay. We just have all day jobs. We have a lot going on. Sure. And we want to cooperate. We respect the role of the IG, et cetera. And I think that's reasonable. I mean, it's reasonable as a concern. The question is which is the higher priority, right? And is there, do you worry about, I don't know, spoliation? What happens in those 90 days? And so let me ask you just for a second, what, in your experience, there's a subpoena issued and that compels what? Immediate compliance, like drop everything the IG has made a request? Or, what's the balance there? Right. Okay. So this would be no different. I mean, ours follow the same pattern as a federal grand jury subpoena, which gives a return date. Now that doesn't, and so what happens is it's an investigative subpoena that's issued by the court and it gives a return date. Now, if there's an attorney for the entity that, that receive the subpoena and they call and they make a reasonable request for an extension, most of the time we're going to grant that, especially if it appears that they're in good faith and they're trying to compile the information. But we have run into situations where they're not always in good faith, and spoliation is one of your main concerns. I have the advantage at the IG's office down here of being able to run a criminal search warrant if we have necessary probable cause. And of course, we've done over the course of 15 years, probably couple of dozen, maybe. It's been years since the last one we did, but it got litigated in federal court and we prevailed. That warrant was upheld in federal court. And I know so obviously you're not talking about search warrant authority. I think that, certainly, in fact, I would also make this observation. I don't get into the habit of sending subpoenas to state agencies because they already have a duty to cooperate with me. So really a written request should be sufficient. That's the same thing that you have in really the subpoena at that point would be the last resort. It would be the kind of thing where it's okay if an agency is, 90 days seems like a way more than sufficient time to get to, unless the request is just really onerous. I mean, if you're asking for, years worth of records or such, sometimes that can take a while to compile. So right. No, I got it. No, it's helpful. And let me just go, and Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, if you don't mind, I just want to finish my last question,
Sure.
if that's okay with you.
Certainly.
So you talked about the Oversight Board, and I've been asking about that a bit over the last several meetings. And I guess part of the problem is that the word oversight is such a, you you have to know what you mean by that, right? So could you just talk a little bit more? I mean, you say obviously there's no oversight board here. Most don't have, you said, an oversight board. But I'm just sort of wondering if you think there's practical purposes for that. And obviously, a board like that could go anywhere from sounding board, like, hey, can I talk this through confidentially with you guys, to evaluative of the IG's performance.
Yep.
And I don't know, I could think of a bunch if I thought about it, different functions. So I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about potential roles for an oversight board and what it could potentially mean. How many different flavors does that come in?
Yeah. That's an excellent question, and it's one that let me say that in the state of Louisiana, there are 3 inspectors general. My office, which is the Louisiana State Inspector General, we have statewide jurisdiction. The city of New Orleans has an inspector general with an oversight board. It's called the New Orleans Ethics Review Board. And then right next door in Jefferson Parish, it's the adjoining parish or county, it has a parish inspector general that also has the Jefferson Parish Ethics and Compliance Commission that oversees. And when I say oversee, let's see, that's a great question. What does it mean to oversee and what does it not mean? Well, the first thing it means is that well, let me tell you what it doesn't mean. It does not mean directing the investigative activity of the inspector general. That much is clear, because that compromises independence. However, and I think in Jefferson, they also have a separate committee called the Quality Assurance Review Board, which a couple of times a year will render, they will review and render opinions on the IG's performance. And the oversight board typically does review the IG's performance. They review and they receive regular reports on, for instance, work plans, like, oh, this is what we plan to look at in 2022. These are the areas of concern. Mm-hmm. Also, sometimes the oversight boards receive complaints that they then refer on to the inspector general for further investigation. Sometimes they receive complaints against the sitting IG, in which case they usually will appoint a committee to investigate those. And so there are ways that it can be done. So you can see the importance of eliminating the conflict of interest, because you don't want either side to be either compromised in appearance or actuality of, in that situation. But it definitely does not mean directing the investigative activities because that's when you start to run into the Newton's third law, the equal and opposite reaction. That's where you're going to start to have conflict.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for all that. Mr. Chair, thanks for the time.
I'm glad to do it.
Certainly, John. I recognize that Tom, I believe you had a question, and then Joanne.
Yeah, thank you very much. There are several ways in which the Maryland statute diverges from the model legislation and what's recommended in the Green Book. And I'm trying to get a sense of whether they fall into the category of, oh, it'd be better to do it this way, but it's not that critical, or this is really critical. One of the areas is the funding, and whether the funding is going to be a fixed percentage of the general fund or just a budgetary item how critical is that?
Well, I will say just in general that the issue of funding is one of the most critical for IGs. Now, let me give you guys context. The Louisiana OIG statute contains language that the legislature shall adequately fund the inspector general to ensure that we are able to carry out the mission that's laid out by statute. Now, I learned, and those of you who are attorneys that deal with legislation and the latest expression of legislative will, that's what I learned that lesson, which means that they're free to ignore what they did before if it's not in the state constitution. And so I think now they realize that hey, that's just because let's face it, especially in a place like Louisiana, is there a better man bites dog story than the Louisiana legislature trying to shut down the IG? I mean, and it played that way in the press, and I think they understood that after a period of time. But no, that is a great way to put it. Funding is absolutely crucial. Now, there's no cookie cutter approach to this. The city of New Orleans has a guaranteed percentage of the annual budget. So whatever that budget is, they use that factor to divide that, and that's how they come up with their appropriation each year. Our funding, I've got to go in front of the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Finance Committee every single year, and I've got to go sit there and defend what we've done and to report to them on what we've done. And they get to decide whether or not we get the same appropriation or maybe a little bit more, depending on what our needs are. But I can tell you, funding is one of the areas that's, that you can come at an IG if it's not protected. So that's one thing. And then what happens when funding is protected? Well, there are other ways then to sort of hinder. And, I can tell, like the bureaucracy in the city of New Orleans can be very difficult. I can remember Bob Sarasoli tried to order computers and had trouble with the orders getting processed. And then when they did show up, they had boxes that had already been torn open. So we had to have them swept. And, it was just, there's this kind of thing where you want the funding is really critical to protect. I'm not sure that the guaranteed percentage is the only way to do it, but it is a good way, I think.
Thank you. And I had the same question with respect to IGs conducting audits. In Baltimore County, they do investigations, but they don't conduct audits. There's a county auditor. How critical is it, do you think, for the IG to have the authority to conduct audits?
Well, I think it's important in almost every jurisdiction. If you ever look at our statute, I've got the authority to do audits. I have made a policy decision within my discretion as IG to focus on the criminal investigative side. And the reason for that is because we have a state auditor right down the street that has over 300 employees that does those audits and who we have an excellent working relationship with. Anytime, and I'm sure you guys have been through it, where you got a serious budget crunch. This happened to us a few years ago where we had a $2 billion hole. That's billion with a B. So you've got everybody down in the legislature looking for, okay, where can we cut? Because we're not going to be able to raise taxes to cover this deficit. So, or it's unlikely because it requires a 2/3 vote of the, and it's just hard to get there, So yeah, that's as it relates to all of these issues. And I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Can you bring me right back to it's just
how critical is it that IG
the audit function? Right. I apologize. I was rambling a little bit. Okay. The audit function is a very important function for any IG's office. I think because if it's done correctly, well, there's two kinds of audits. One is the basic financial condition audit, or what they call the CAFR, the Certified Annual Financial Review. And then there's the forensic audits that are based upon a particular complaint of wrongdoing. So that might involve, for instance, many of the criminal cases that we have made involve misuse of state credit cards, and sometimes into the many millions of dollars, outrageous fraud. And that stuff is found through the audit process typically. So I think it's a good idea to do it. And of course, when you're doing audits, you're going to be in compliance with not only the Green Book, but if you're doing government audits, a lot of times those audits are required to be done according to the Red Book or the Yellow Book. And I'll leave it to the auditors and maybe to Robin to talk about that. But I think it is an important function. I have made the policy decision here in Louisiana to get the biggest bang for the taxpayer dollar by trying to make as many successful criminal cases as we can. And there are no shortage of them down here, believe me. I mean, we with two former prosecutors on staff, we don't bring anything to the United States Attorney's Office that I wouldn't be proud to stand in front of a jury and try myself. I'm not all about passing political headaches on to the next guy. So if the case is legally flawed, typically we won't bring it, or we might have a discussion with them, and to say, hey, look, what do you think? Do you agree with us on this? And look, those relationships, I'll tell you that one thing I did not see necessarily in the in the Baltimore County statute is the ability to do joint investigations with other law enforcement and oversight. I know we have that very specific authority, so that's allowed me to embed agents with the FBI field offices here throughout the state, and it's just been an excellent relationship. And you know, when you're a task force officer, you essentially get the same credentials and you have access to all of the same systems, and it's been a really good, again, I use that term symbiont. It's been an excellent tool for us to make significant criminal cases.
Thank you. And my final question was, as you may be aware, the IG in Baltimore County is also the executive director of the Ethics Commission, which does, you know, trainings and conducts investigations of conduct investigations of their own and give ethical advice, et cetera, et cetera. Are there any pitfalls in having the IG be the head of that office in addition to, you know, having the IG's office, or does that work out fine?
I think it will, and I'm not gonna make a blanket statement. I think I might even defer to the folks like Robin who researched this, but let me tell you where I see an obvious pitfall, because we've been offered those opportunities to conduct training of state employees down here. And one of the reasons why we don't do it is because we don't want to build in a defense to any criminal case that might be brought later on. Hey, well, I sat in a room with the IG and they told me this was perfectly fine to do, you know. And even though that's an oversimplification, obviously, but I think that there is a potential conflict there that you'd have to think about. Like, for instance, if that person received training from the IG and then later on gets arrested and charged, you know, or even if they're not charged, is up in the middle of a big administrative controversy where funds were misused, it's very likely that they may use the fact that the IG wore a different hat in that situation to try to, you know, either get the IG bumped out of it or to say that, hey, this is a defense for me. So that's the first and most obvious one. You know, I'm sure there are others that might be able to chime in on that.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all I have.
Those were great questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Joanne?
Yes, hello, and thank you so much
Hello.
for joining us this evening. You know, a few meetings back, and apologies, I don't have my notes in front of me. We had the CAO, the county executive CAO, join us, and she expressed some concerns about, you know, ultimately, like, not knowing how investigations were happening, you know, not knowing how the office runs and so forth. Are there any, you know, obviously we want the IG's office to, you know, be truly independent, but are there any examples where, you know, the council, or in our case, it would be the council, the county executive, their staff are able to engage or have some type of a role in the IG's office while still maintaining its independence? If that's even possible.
Yes, and that's a great question. Thank you for bringing it up. I think that there's again, we're dealing with that natural tension that exists, and it's and let me give you an example. We here get on average, we get many hundreds of complaints per year. Only about 10 to 12% of those turn into full-blown investigations. So it's entirely possible. Let's put it in the context of Baltimore County. I might get 10 different complaints on the county administrative officer. And if those a lot of times we do a preliminary look and we determine there's no merit to it and we close it out. You don't want to create a situation where you got to notify the CAO or whoever it is every time. You know, you got to have the ability to, because I think it's true of almost every IG's office in the country that only about 20% on the high end of cases are actually going to turn into full-blown investigations, because gosh, we get complaints on any and everything you can possibly imagine. I had a lady the other day complain that her food was had trouble when she was at a Sonic restaurant, and she wanted me to go over there and deal with Sonic. And we were very polite and friendly to her, but we said, no, let me put you in touch with maybe the people that might be able to help you there. It's very difficult to have anybody that's associated with the entity that's subject to the IG's jurisdiction also participate in the daily investigative activity. At some point, they will be made aware let me also say this, that IGs must be able to operate covertly when the circumstances call for it. And one example down here, we got information that an employee of a state agency was engaged in a scheme to steal federal money, and she was working with somebody on the outside, and then they were going to get paid and split it. And we were actually able to go and use audio and video recording equipment to record that payoff and then use that as the basis for a criminal prosecution. None of the laws are different, because I know Maryland's a two-party consent state. So you've got, if you want to do a surreptitious recording, you're going to need a court order up there for that. And those are the kind of things, that's why you need independent counsel to be able to advise you on those things. But I totally understand the concern of the CAO, like wanting to know, and that is a process that I went through. I became the IG in 2008, and I will tell you what, oh my goodness, they were always wanting to know what was going on, and I did my best within the rules to keep them apprised of what was going on. And then one day I worked a case that was so hot that they didn't want to know any more about it. and it was a very high profile deal. And then since that time, the relative newness of the IG in Baltimore County is another issue, because it just takes a little while for both sides to get used to it, to get used to that relationship, because it doesn't automatically have to be hostile. And I think most professional IGs don't try to make it hostile. And so, in fact, we do everything we can to diffuse, those situations. And I think that's what the best IGs do. The most successful ones are the ones that can get the information that they need without engaging in World War III on every case, if that makes any sense. Thank you for that question.
Kathy?
Yeah, and this is actually a follow-up on exactly that point in Joanne's question. My take on a lot of what came from the CAO was that there isn't, for better description, a sort of policy and procedures manual. And it's that tension between independence, being given the liberty to sort of follow the investigation the way you should, versus having some predictability to practice so that the county, and what we were really hearing was agency heads and employees are getting their backs up and just being uncooperative because they don't know where they are in a process and whether it is a target on them or just background information. Do you have an internal just sort of practices manual that's known within the jurisdiction? That's not statutory, that can be a little fluid, but
Again, we have our procedures, sort of a procedures manual here, but it's mostly based on the Green Book in terms of how we do business. I'm not familiar, and I mean, maybe Robin might have heard of a situation, but I'm not familiar with any IG's office where it's regulated at that level. And look, let me say also, can I call you judge? To me, if you're a judge, you've been a judge all your life. So, but anyway, what I would say is that, I get it. They don't want to get blindsided. I get it. I understand totally where those feelings are coming from. But I think the goal is to try to, not necessarily come up with procedures that are so onerous that it robs you of flexibility. Because as you know, sometimes a case starts out one way, and one of the things that I teach for the Inspector General group is cognitive bias. That's been something that I've taught now for a couple of years. And one of the things we talk about is how, as the evidence comes in, your impressions of a case can sometimes change 180 degrees. We've been in this, and I'm sure you've seen this, Judge, in your career, where you have a case that you think is going one way, and then all of a sudden a piece of evidence shows up that totally changes it to the opposite conclusion, where you're getting ready, you think, well, this person's going to get indicted for sure. And then the next thing you know, not only are they not getting indicted, but the rest of the evidence is now in a spot where it can be properly explained. So I think, the short answer to your question is no, I'm not familiar with any policies that are internal that go down to that level.
Okay.
And so I think it's the type of thing that hopefully the IG over time can build a relationship with, while preserving the ability to operate covertly. which is really required for an IG to be the most effective. That doesn't mean you do it every time. But sometimes we can just gather information behind the scenes and not ever have to go knock on anybody's door, you know?
Yeah, I think the growing pains are complicating it at the moment is my.
But that's not, and I'm telling you, the same exact thing happened in Palm Beach County when they had down in Florida where, you know, the first inspector general there was Cheryl Goodman. And I'll tell you what, boy, she had it, that office was created after more than half of the county commissioners went to jail at the same time. That's just a true story. In fact, there was a magazine article they were on the cover and it was called Corruption County. And so that, you know, the public outrage led to the creation of the office. But my gosh, when she first got in there, there was so much resistance. It was just like she was fighting for her life every single day. And now that office is, the IG down there is John Kerry. And you would think that office had been there for 30 years. It's humming along. But it takes time for people to develop confidence. First of all, it took a long time for people to start trusting me down here to realize that, look, if they saw that I was appointed by a Republican, and I think there was sort of an assumption that I was going to be, giving them a break because of that. And if you look through the history of this office, every major case that I worked in the first 5 years was involved a Republican. And they were the ones that tried to shut me down too, twice. So it's kind of an interesting thing, you know, when you truly are nonpartisan, sometimes it takes a while for people to believe that that's true, you know, and you have to sort of demonstrate that over time, that you got no dog in the hunt. Every inspector general on the planet has really one goal. We're going to get to the truth, whatever it is, by any and all legal and ethical means that are available to us. And then when we find the truth, we're going to look for where it intersects with the law. And if those two things are present, and then after that, if we feel like we can make recommendations to improve efficiency or to put in new internal controls, all those kinds of things are the type of things that an IG can be assisting with.
Janine?
I'll start off with your word efficiency. And in my view, and having served as an IG before, I would think that would be something, going back to Joanne's question, where are there efficiencies and where can the IG demonstrate that they are using that sort of methodology? Where are the timeliness? Where are the standards? Where is the consistency? And if an IG can't do that, how can the IG be the overseer to expect others to do that? So in my view, the IG needs to be able to demonstrate good practices to expect others. And I do want to go back to a comment that I believe Mr. Hill made in the beginning. And it had to do with a concern about oversight or a concern about a commission. And I want to put words on it, but my takeaway was that there was a concern about a commission like ours that's doing some work to see what maybe an IG should do or oversight. Or what is Mr. Hill's specific concern around that? Because I see that as being appropriate for wastewater management or for the treatment plan as well. So what is his concern specifically? Thank you.
Greg, if you can answer that since it was your comment.
Sure. That comment was actually directed at the original proposed bill that was put forth for July 5th. And the bigger concern, it wasn't necessarily the concern of the existence of a commission as much as it was the composition of that commission. So I know President Street and the association are not adverse to having oversight of IGs. I mean, IGs are subject to oversight, transparency, and accountability, just like everybody else. It was the mechanism that was set up in conjunction with the other provisions that were contained in that bill.
Thank you. I think that, and we talked about relationships. In my view, it's good to build relationships after we have established a baseline of being efficient, consistent, have standards, and then we can build a relationship from there. But without that, there's no basis for a relationship, in my view.
Well, General Burkhead, let me first of all say that I in preparation for this meeting, I read about just the individual commission members, and I was, you have a very impressive military record, and I want, and I'm not just saying that, I am I'm in awe of you guys that have dedicated your lives to the service of our country. And I want you to know how much I personally appreciate that. And you make an excellent point there, that, IGs should be held to a higher standard. We are, in fact, that whenever an IG gets in trouble, and it does happen, it has happened, our IG down in New Orleans, not the last one, had to leave office, and, we're held to the not just to the same standard, but really to a higher one, because we're supposed to be examples for the entire public and the government to live up to, and so you make an excellent point there. And I think the standards that you're talking about, I think do exist in the term, and I understand they may be more general than what you guys would look for, but the principles and standards, the Green Book has all of those areas. And so, in fact, many IGs are required by statute to follow the Green Book. I'm one of those offices that's required to follow it. It's actually standards such as the Green Book. So I have a little flexibility there. But you make an excellent point, and I certainly understand why you would say that. But anyway, thank you again for your service.
Thank you.
So I have a question for you, and either Mr. Street, Mr. Hill, or Dr. Kemp, with regard to persons who are the subject of investigation, should there either in legislation or policy be specifically delineated rights for individuals who are either the subject of investigation or a part of, witness to, et cetera, investigation?
That's a great question. I'll take it first. And Mr. Chairman, the closest analogy that I can think of for that would be what in many states and in many municipalities, there's a law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights. So that would apply to internal affairs investigations for law enforcement. Anytime a law enforcement officer is under an investigation where they can be disciplined or fired, then they are required to be notified that they're under investigation. They're required to be told what the investigation is about and that sort of thing. I had not run into a situation where that applied more broadly than say, like, for instance, the internal affairs is a very specific deal with a specific set of evidentiary standards. For instance, people can be compelled to be interviewed, whereas in an ordinary criminal investigation or anything that might result in criminal consequences, they can refuse to talk without fear of being fired or let go. Now, I do know that the Baltimore County statute does say that you'd be disciplined if you don't cooperate with the IG. So it's a little bit different on that. I don't believe that that's a standard that's widely applied across IG's offices that do investigations that go beyond the realm of internal affairs. But the circumstance that you described to me is the law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights, where they would be required to be notified. And I think there might be some difficulty in implementing something like that with an IG that has such a broad area of responsibility. That's just my thought. I certainly know there are others who might share varying opinions on that issue.
I don't know, Mr. Hill, whether you or Dr. Kemp had any response. If not, it's okay.
Yeah, just building off of what Stephen and the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. I mean, there's a number of different cases that are out that provide for different provisions. Weingarten, Garrity, Loudermill, obviously Miranda. So there are case laws, circumstances out there that guide and set boundaries for investigations, given the circumstances. All those depend on administrative, criminal, what the repercussions are. And so those evolve over time as the case law proceeds. So I don't know whether you would necessarily want to box yourself in with a legislative provision that isn't proven in court already and stands by those propositions.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, can I chime in one additional point on that? I think that one of the, and I believe it's one of the commissioners earlier, I think it was John, brought up spoliation, and part of the reason for an IG's office being able to allow or having the ability to operate covertly is to prevent just that exact thing. In other words, either evidence being destroyed or altered, or witnesses being intimidated. So sometimes if you're in a spot where you have to actually notify the target of the investigation before you can even get started, that can be a non-starter depending on what it is that you're looking at it. You know what, we've worked some very high profile cases down here where it was argued that we should have notified, and one in particular was a statewide commissioner that was misusing law enforcement databases for all different kinds of improper reasons. That person was eventually charged criminally, and there's still civil litigation flowing out of that. But I think any situation like that would probably need to be limited strictly to the sort of internal discipline, and it would be difficult to box yourself in, as Greg put it. So that would be my cautionary tale on that, is that the IG needs to, when appropriate, have the ability to operate covertly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for either Mr. Street, Mr. Hill, or Dr. Kim? No. Well, let me thank all three of you for just sharing a lot of information. You've given us a lot to think about. And so we appreciate your time, your expertise, and your willingness to share your knowledge with us. Thank you again.
Thank you, sir. Glad to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
And so we're coming somewhat to an end. Just a quick report on our subcommittees. Our two subcommittees each meet or have met once this month, and we'll be meeting again next week. And we hope to have the subcommittee's data collection done this month so that we can start working on the report next month. That's our goal, and hopefully we'll be able to reach that. Under other commission business, I'd like to ask Dr. Fitznetz if there's an update on the ethical climate survey or the report on best practices from our last meeting.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. With respect to the ethical climate survey, we are working to make the updates discussed at our last meeting, specifically such as concerning the number of responses to questions and more information on significance, including statistical significance where it would be useful. For the best practices research, Inspector General Madigan actually brought forward a few discrepancies about the subpoena timeline I mentioned for two of the observations. We looked into it and we are making corrections for those items with respect to the wait time before they can issue a subpoena. In addition, we have just overall started verifying the data we found. That's part of our normal research process, and we had planned to do it before the final report on the research was made later this year. We just unfortunately didn't have time to do that before the last commission meeting, as we were trying to also produce that information with the report on the ethical climate survey. So we are verifying that, and I do plan to provide another update at the October commission meeting about the status of both of these. I'm happy to answer any of the questions now.
Okay. Are there any questions for Dr. Fitznetz? Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Fitznetz. Do any commission members have other commission business to discuss? If not, on behalf of County Executive Olszewski and citizens of Baltimore County, I want to thank the members of the commission for volunteering your time and expertise to carry out the important work of the commission. Are there any additional comments or questions from commission members? If not, let me just once again thank our experts who testified today for their testimonies and the great work that they're doing in their jurisdictions. And hearing no other comments or questions, that is the end of our agenda tonight. Our next scheduled meeting is next Tuesday, September 20th. Trying to make sure I have that correct. However, if they're looking at the status of our commission and speaking with the Schaefer and the staff on our plan going forward, I'm going to suggest that we cancel that meeting. One of our subcommittees will meet then, and the next meeting of the full commission will be on Thursday, October 20th at 5:30 p.m. on Zoom. And so you can register to attend that meeting and our future commission meetings on our website at blueribbonethics.ubalt.edu. Any questions about this from commission members? That our next commission meeting will be October 20th at 5:30 rather than the September 20th meeting. Is that clear to everyone? Okay, thank you. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
May I have a second?
Second.
With that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.